My name is Nora Bateson, and I am visiting you today from Stockholm, Sweden. Clearly, I'm not very Swedish, but I came originally from California, and then I lived in Canada, and then I lived in Asia, and then now I live in Stockholm. And I'm saying that because Stelio brought up an interesting beginning point today, which is the idea of how we think about ourselves in the contexts that we're in. Okay? So today I want to talk about this thing I've been playing with, which is warm data. Warm data, yay, it's up. Here's the thing. We have a moment that we are coexisting in when there is a lot of change. Work is changing. Technology is moving. Governance is having to respond to that. The climate is changing. The need to think about what education is for a new sort of culture that has other kinds of work means rapid change there. Our notions around health are having to respond to that as well. What are the stress levels, depression levels, suicide levels, oxygen, water, plastics, etc. We're having to respond to the changes in our world at rates that are unprecedented. Of course, in response to that, culture is also shifting. Language is shifting. Political parties are coming out of nowhere with rhetorics that seem to be so confusing. Somehow, people who used to make sense to you don't make sense to you anymore. And everybody says about everybody else, how on earth could they be thinking that? Right? So we are in a complex system. The big complex system that we're in is the ecosphere. Then we have another set of complex systems, which are our socio-economic, cultural systems, another set of complexities. And then there's another one, which is the complexity of our conceptual understanding and shared contextual sense-making of those other two. Are you with me? So we have these kind of three pieces. I only have two arms, so you have to imagine the other one. Three intersecting big complexities, inside of which there are millions of other ones. The reason that's important is that there is a need for us to get from one day to the next, to make decisions, to do things, to take care of our children, to contribute to our communities, to live our lives, to hopefully find some meaning in them, to create goodness, to fall in love, to make art, to piss people off, whatever it is we need to do. And in doing so, what is necessary is that we receive information and we respond to it. Now, in the tech world, this has been blooming into the concept of big data, right? And big data is really exciting because you can get lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of points of information, and you can put them together. And you can start to get patterns, and you can start to find various ways of making new kinds of decisions based on those patterns. And I was at a session on big data several years ago when big data was just being born. And I sat in this session in the belly of the beast in the SAS Institute. Anybody ever work with the SAS Institute in here? That's the place Google sends all our information, and then it gets categorized and sent back to the NSA or wherever. Yeah. And I'm sitting there thinking, something is not right. Because since the 16th century, the way in which science has eliminated the woo-woo factor, the crazy this and the, magic that and the this and the stuff that was snake oil and lies and so on and so forth, was to have what was called the scientific methodology. Okay, this is a methodology that was generated to provide trust and truth and facts out of science and the inquiry of this process, so that research could be reliable. All right, and I'll just touch on this slightly, but a couple of the main issues around this are that we could pull things out of context, whatever those things were. Study students, study financial trends, study bacteria, study whatever. This drug, that behavior. And the way that was done was to, like I said, to pull things out of context, to create definitions, to create experiments that could be repeated by multiple people from multiple perspectives and get the same result. Okay, that was called objectivity. All right? And that those experiments could be measured and they could be expressed in measurement. Now, that was good. It's given us most of what we see in our world. All right? My airplane flies, my laptop works. Things are good. There's just one small problem, which is that if we continue to make decisions based on only information that has been decontextualized, we're actually on a collective suicide mission. The decisions, the responses, the problems we face now, almost entirely, are in the complexity. We can define them as wicked problems. They are, some of the things I mentioned earlier. The relationship between my body's health and my work life, the ecology, my home life, my mental state, and my financial state. Where's the medicine for that? So, because so much of our information is produced by decontextualizing these complex systems, the decisions that get made are premised upon blind spots. In order to understand complex systems, we've got to put them back in to that complexity and study again. Okay? I'm not saying we don't need reductionist information. I'm saying we need both. Let me make that very clear. It's just that right now we have a pretty significant imbalance. To the point that, for some reason, warm data is like this new idea. It's not a new idea. This is not a new idea. It's just basically something we can refer to and we can say we need that warm data. Warm data can be defined as, good morning, transcontextual information about the interrelationships that integrate a complex system. Ouch. Okay, let's start at the beginning. Who am I? I'm just going to give you an input into this notion of transcontextual. I am a speaker, okay? I'm a woman. I have an American passport, but I have a Swedish one too, and an English one. I'm a filmmaker, I'm a writer. I'm a mom, I have 6 kids. I'm a daughter. I'm a partner, I'm a friend. I am working with ecologists, but I'm also working with educators. I'm working with creating new patterns of economy. I'm working with people in technology. I am 40 trillion organisms that are in interaction with the world around me. Who am I? Okay? In every one of those contexts, I exist in a very different kind of communication pattern. Relational, interactional patterns, not the same. The way that I am with my children and the way my microbiome is with you, those are languages that do not understand each other. Or do they? Where do they? So, not only are we talking context, folks, that was rough. That was Systems 1.0. Now we got to do trans-contextual. We got to recognize there's multiple contexts. And how those contexts are in relationship, that's the warm data. Okay? Listing the contexts, that gets you somewhere. But it doesn't get you to the big question, which is how are they in interrelational process? That's the warm data. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is that for anyone in the room who's saying, yeah, but I just want this to be simple, I'm with you all the way. It's just that the opposite of complexity is not simplicity. It's reductionism. Simplicity is beautiful. All right? A little flower. And you could pick that flower and you could say, it's so simple. It's just a flower. But if you look at it where it lives in its context, there's nothing simple about that. Look at the complexity that it takes to produce a simple flower. A simple craving for chocolate. Right? It's so simple. I just want chocolate. Where does that come from? Is that cultural? Is it biological? Is it have something to do with the mythology of chocolate? Is my candida too high? Am I sad? Like, what's up with that chocolate thing? Is it part of the marketeering? Is it media? Have I been convinced of this? It's just a simple craving for chocolate. So the recognition of that is really useful because we live in a world that is irritatingly starved for false simplicity. And every time we go there, we're actually committing the violence of reductionism. When you pull something out of context and start to define it, those definitions sever it, cut it from the context in which it is vital. You kill it. Now, it's okay. We all studied dead frogs. We learned a lot from the dead frogs. But we didn't learn a lot about how frogs are in relationship with other things. Okay? So it's not that we don't learn things from killing stuff, it's that we don't learn everything. That contextual vitality is needed. The warm data is needed. Life is messy. Warm data is messy. This is not something that is going to sit nicely in a report or is going to have graphs or is going to look in any way like what you're thinking a data report might look like. And that's good. That's good. I want to just say that this is the beginning of this, that this work on warm data that I've been doing with the Bateson Institute is a product of our beginnings of research on how systems learn, which is another whole topic. You can look up my work and find that if you're interested. But I'll give you just a quick version. We started asking the question, how do systems get unstuck? And what we learned is that that was a very tricky question. Because in order for systems, living systems, to be stuck, other living systems have to be in rapid compensatory behavior to keep them stuck. And so, are they stuck? Well, where's the edge of the system? Are you with me? So we started to recognize that wasn't a very good question, but we went ahead with the research, and we found we went into some clinics that were working with paralysis thinking this is a pretty good example of a stuck system. The body is a system, paralysis is a stuckness. We'll start there. It may not be a clean question, but it's something to start with. And what we learned was that when people were coming out of paralysis, it wasn't that they came unstuck. It was that their whole cognitive interaction with their body and the world around them had shifted. They learned. So what we found was that systems don't get unstuck, they learn. That's a big shift because it shifts the focus from asking, how do I get this stuck system unstuck, and that being the problem, and then coming in with direct correctives or solutions to that problem, to another whole parameter, another whole horizon of question, which was this: how is this stuck system making sense of its world, and how might it learn to make sense of its world in another way? I'll give you an example. You're taking a walk in the forest, you come to a crooked tree. And you might ask yourself, how do we fix the crooked tree? How do we make this tree straight? There's other trees, same kind of tree in the same forest, standing straight and tall. But this tree is crooked. You could trim it, you could tie it. Or you could ask another question. How is this tree making sense of its world? What are the trans-contextual interrelationships that this tree is within, in which this crookedness makes sense? If I want to change the crookedness of the tree, fixing the tree is not probably the best plan. Adjusting the context and the conditions in which the tree is becoming will allow for an ecosystem change, a systemic change. Okay, but that's a very different question. So when we asked that question, the first thing we needed was relational information. If I'm going to get at that question, I need another kind of information. I don't really need to know about the earthworms and the soil bacteria and the shadows and the squirrels and the this and the that. I need to know about the relationships between them. Right? So a study of squirrels helps, but it doesn't really do the thing. A study of oak trees helps, but it doesn't really tell me what I need to know about this contextual process. I need the warm data. So we're at the beginning of this. And so I have a book coming out in the spring on it, but it's still just first impressions of this process. So I'm inviting you kind of into this embryonic stages of this really cool field that's coming up quickly. And it's, when we're dealing with what we call wicked problems or problems in complex systems, this is what we're going to have to be dealing with. And the one thing I would like to say just first of all is it's really fun. Don't worry about the complexity. It's fun. We do it anyway. Not one business deal was ever made without warm data. Right? Nobody ever fell in love without warm data. It never happened. We've been doing this forever. There's nothing to be afraid of. Just don't think you can put it on a graph. This is a quote from my dad. Some of you have studied Bateson in your work. In 1972, he said, "At present, there's no existing science whose special interest is the combining of pieces of information. But I shall argue that the evolutionary process must depend on such double increments of information. Every evolutionary step is an addition of information to an already existing system. Because this is so, and here's the hitch, the combinations, harmonies, and discords, that's the warm data, between successive pieces and layers information will present many, there's an N missing, problems of survival and determine many directions of change." Okay, what we're talking about here is the combinations, harmonies, and discords between successive pieces of information. Not the easy, there were 5 of these or 4 of those. This is not the easy stuff, guys. This is the relational process. And it doesn't sit nicely. So I have a few criteria, and I have 36 seconds. Do you want me to take another 5 minutes? Okay. All right. I'm going to just make the assumption that enough people in this room have enough base in systems studies and complexity studies to get what I mean when I say observing the observer. This is basic second-order cybernetics. It depends on who's doing the observing, doesn't it? What you see depends on who's looking. Okay? That is a relational process. That's warm data, right there. Right? Who's looking? Right now, we're in a real crisis with science because actually, anything you want to find the research to prove is apparently out there. Nuclear energy will save the world. Nuclear energy will destroy the world. GMOs are good for everybody. GMOs are going to kill every living thing. There's plenty of research for all of it, but who did the research? Who paid for the research? How do we know who to believe? What is that process? Okay, so in the interest of rebuilding trust, we're going to have to actually not make things tighter, but make things looser. Ask relational questions. In order to do that, we need multiple description. Okay, so that means we need multiple perspectives. What happens when this person studies it? What happens when that person studies it? What happens when this culture looks at it? What happens when this sector looks at it, or that sector? And that's not the only kind of multiple description, because it does not need to all be in academic prose. We also need art, we need stories, we need songs, we need ways of making description that go beyond the monotone discourse of what we know now as information. I have a friend in South America who's been working with a group of indigenous people to get their land rights back. And the first thing he did was ask them to make a map of their land. And what do you think happened? Which map? They made maps. There was the sacred rights map, there was the food map, there was the history map, there was the ancient gods map, there was the seasons map, there was the, right? Warm data. And which is their land? Well, their land is in the relationship between those maps. It's not in any of them. They're all relevant, but you need that multiple description in order to get at this, the complex information. Pattern. Well, what that should say is not pattern, and I'm highlighting the fact that that is the wrong word. What we, in this moment, most need to be addressing is the fact that pattern is no longer pattern. The world we live in is fluid patterning. We are no longer doing fixed patterns, not of climate, not of our own body functions, not of our dreams, not of our children's futures. We are in another moment, and it's really important to recognize that the patternings that we are seeing are changing, right? Change changes change. And we're in it, babe. One thing I love about warm data is that it is all about paradox, inconsistency, and contradiction, because when you are in any kind of complex relational process and you add time, what happens? Everything changes, right? So you're not going to get the same results twice. That piece of scientific methodology where you get the same results twice, we can't have that in warm data. If that happens, something's up. Because as relationships change, paradoxes, contradictions, all kinds of things come up. So those things are portals into warm data, into relational process. You come to a paradox or an inconsistency or a contradiction, usually that's the information you get rid of because it messes up your data. In this case, bring it on. That's the entry point into a whole lot of relational process. Holism and reductionism, we need both. Cultural responsibility, no possible way that I can say how important that is right now. We who have lived in the Western narrative have no idea how blind we are. Case closed. The blind spot is just phenomenal, and it's entrained into us through the academic world, through our employment world, through the structure of our cities. Our entire belief system has infected and contaminated our ability to perceive. We in the Western world need to be really careful that we have multiple cultural vistas on this. And that doesn't mean having a panel with one Indian person and one black person and one Chinese person. That's not what it means, because how many conferences have we all been to where that was a good start, but frankly, they all went to Harvard. They all read the same books, right? So this is something we really have to work on. Now, the other thing is that if you're talking about a relational process, if you're talking about any kind of complex system, and it's the life, the vitality, the source of this system is in those relationships, the aesthetic of the relationships matters. What's the mood? What's the feeling? All right? That's the logic in which the relationship, the communication happens. That's a radical thing I just said. All right, our notion of rationale has to do with absolutely removing things like emotion and aesthetic. And what I'm saying is the aesthetic, even if it's in a biological, if you have a thriving jungle, there is an aesthetic to the way things are growing together, as opposed to one that is depleted. The aesthetic is the logic. That one hurts. I'm going to stop. I'll just leave this there. And now you guys have some time to form some questions. So come to groups of 3 and come up with something really fast, because I don't want to run out of time and your lunch is coming up. So you have how many minutes? 5. 5 minutes. And then we'll do questions. Okay? So, to talk amongst yourselves. Yeah.
We couldn't listen to you all day. How long are you staying with us today?
My flight goes at 7, so I need to be there at 6. So I probably stay for the yeah. Yeah, reading your book, one can build a relationship with God. So I have it with me, so maybe you have. I will sign. You have. And bring the video. Can I borrow your phone?
okay if they text the questions?
I would rather they
Just
just,
let them get them.
yeah.
And we probably can have 2 or 3, not that many, and then because it's still.
How many, can you
Put another time clock up there for when we have to go to lunch.
Yeah, because it's 12:30. Yeah. So let's see how long.
Okay.
I'm hearing you again. So.
Okay. I know.
Whoa, it's wonderful to see the energy in the room. And I'm going to try the impossible to stop the flow of thoughts. Because it was wonderful to see first the what? And then, wow, the energy in the room. So we'll have questions. We'll have time for 3-4 questions. But what I want to tell you is that Nora is going to stay with us for lunch and even in the time during the open space. So also think about what is it that it is important to ask now. And what is it maybe that's more of a question for the afternoon to talk about together? Yeah? So questions.
Is this on? Yeah, okay.
My name is Csaba Engyel, and I would like to ask you, we had a small discussion of this in a small group, how would you contextualize all these thoughts into OD?
In what?
Organizational design. How would you contextualize all these thoughts into OD?
I mean, I have to tell you, I think OD's been doing this for a long time. But my hope, and I kind of poked at it in the room next door, is that we can start to think about what's the edge of the organization in another way. To me, this is the big question. I think it's a mistake to think that what's happening in the organization is happening in the organization. Right? The organization is the crooked tree. So if your therapy is to the organization, it's missing the context. All right? We are in a moment where the institutions and the organizations of our world are in a kind of ecology. They're patterned together. All right? And so what we're in real danger of right now is everybody doing their job. If you look at the Nuremberg trials, and you will see what every Nazi said, I was just doing my job. We can't have that. That's not going to work. Now we have to go into what I would call the liminal space, the space between the organizations and the institutions of our world. Because you know what? That's where we live. I am the education system. I am the political system. I am the health system. I am the business world. I am the family. I am the history. It's all right here. Right? So this line that we draw where we have particular sets of interactions that are locked in this kind of eddy, you know what an eddy is? Inside the organization, we've got to work on how is the organization in relation to the ecosphere, the education system, the health system, and so on. This is not just saying we have to generate transdisciplinary discourse and, intersector communication. That's like this big. We need to be in that space, create community in that space, create new language, new bridges. So what this means for OD is, first of all, recognizing that the vitality of the system is in the interrelational process with the larger context. The unit of survival, in biological terms, is not the organism. The unit of survival is the organism in relation to its environment. And that's the piece. Does that make sense? So it's going to take some doing. This kind of talk hasn't really opened the membranes yet. But we're going to have to go there. Yeah.
You talked at the start of your talk about the fact that we're all on a collective sort of suicide mission at the moment and we're all about to crash. And that made me think of CO2 emissions and the challenges the environment faces. So I'd like to ask you, deliberately trying to make a tricky question for you here. If you had the option where, as ruler of the world, somebody would come to you and say, okay, I've got two things I can offer you. I can offer you either putting people into the liminal space or a guaranteed reduction of carbon emissions to no net emissions of carbon from 2050 onwards, what would you take?
Well, first of all, 2050 is way too late. But
choose your date. Choose your date. That's fine. Choose your date.
But I want to say two things about this. Okay, the first thing is, if we got spanking clean energy that was free, that made no carbon anything tomorrow, we would be dead even faster. Because it would justify the possibility of us continuing to use resources and to continue to be in these relationships of exploitation. And it would be unfettered. So the worst possible thing that could happen is that we got clean energy tomorrow. That's not a solution, because the issue is actually at the level of how we are interacting with each other and the natural world. Hold on. So absolutely everything that I have on, most of the things in this room, the bulk of our lunch that's waiting for us, is made possible by exploitation and extraction. 80% of the world is looking at the question of basic needs. So having clean energy doesn't change the chemistries that are in the water. It doesn't stop the level of conceptual justification for that exploitation. But then the other thing I want to say is, we love to talk about emergence. Emergence is cool, emergence is beautiful, emergence is full of possibility. But let me say something. Emergency is also emergence. And so what becomes the task is to use that beautiful thinking that is so embracing and open around emergence in the face of emergency. Because in the face of emergency, it goes shoo, and we come up with binaries. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it legal? Is it illegal? Is it left? Is it right? Is it us? Is it them? And that habit, I mean, we're tasked with holding that space. It's easy enough to say, yeah, but 90% of the people that I'm going to interact with in a day couldn't possibly do that. So you know what? If I can do it, I better. Just hold it open. Keep the complexity there. Because complexity is not an invitation to paralysis. All right? It's not like I'm going to sit here before somebody who's overdosed on heroin and think, oh, but the context and the context of the context and right? It's not that. The behavior might be the same, okay? The response to somebody in overdose is to give them the antidote, right? But the way in which that action is held, the way in which I see that person, the way in which my body touches their body, the way in which my voice, the way in which my whole interaction with that person is informed by my contextual understanding. If I see someone there and I think, what a loser, bad choices, you deserve it. They're here, we're just going to save another one and I'll be here next week to save you again. You're just a tax on society. Or if I'm sitting there thinking, this is a person who is actually holding the pain of our culture, who's resting within this, whose ability, I mean, are we not all facing the patterns of addiction? Why can't we change our patterns? We know they're bad for us. Why can't we change them? Are we so different than that heroin addict? So the point is that that notion of complexity is useful in the minute action of immediate emergency. And often people want to be like, yeah, but you're just in a privileged position where you can contemplate and philosophize in this abstraction. But it's not abstract, actually. The ability to perceive complexity in yourself, right, that transcontextual description, is really the ultimate act of love. If you can perceive that complexity in another person, in another organism, it's the ultimate act of love. Yeah.
Nora, I'm very much into what you say, but what I find really difficult at the moment is the sort of longing for firm leadership, looking at Trump, looking at Orban, looking at Erdogan, and it's like there is, well, it feels like a war. So what is your response to that?
Well, what we have is a very crooked tree. and the crooked tree factor. So what's happening is that the questions that are being asked are not questions that deal with the actual warm data of the process. I just spent 4 days with the Club of Rome on their 50th anniversary. And there were some of the world's top climate scientists, top economists, top people in all these different fields of energy, making clean energy, and so on and so forth. And they provided a lot of beautiful information, shocking, depressing maybe. But what I left with was the recognition that they don't understand how they come together. They just, that piece is not there. And so, you know, you have a committee of people who are dedicated to each one of the tiles in the SDGs, as though they were separate, right? Clean oceans, no poverty, equality in gender. You know what I'm talking about with the SDGs, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. There's these 17 UN Sustainable. And they're not separate issues. But billions are getting put into each one. We have huge committees for oceans and huge committees for gender and huge committees for poverty, but nothing about how gender equality might be related to oceans. That's the question. What is the conceptual process of exploitation that allows for both of those problems? And how do we address that? So my feeling is we're asking the wrong questions. And part of that gets back to that emergence thing. And it's the responsibility, I think, of the press, of the education system, of the elder generations. This is really intergenerational. To start asking better questions. We need to ask questions that pull us into wider understanding. You know, the immigration question is not a question of should we let them in or should we keep them out. That's not the question. The question is, we're in a changing world with rapidly changing political, religious, and ecological possibilities for people to feed their children. And so they're moving. And so it could be us, right? The current is changing 450 times faster than they thought. How long will our little happy position in Europe or the east coast of the United States be livable? Is it so hard to imagine it could be us moving? So we're not asking the question, which is how do we get better at this? So I don't know if that helps, but leadership, I have a whole course I'm doing on leadership in the liminal space. How to get leadership into the liminal space. One more? Yeah.
Yeah, hi. So I'm really struck by thinking back over this morning and now your presentation, because the 3 papers that were submitted and voted on by 1,000 people, each one of them had a numbered list in them of stable, dynamic, or whatever it was. I can't remember the other 2. And the numbered lists seem to be what are not asking what is the question, because the numbered lists don't show the context in which you apply the thinking, if there is any, behind the numbered lists. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a really interesting contrast, because we've had a lot of discussion about internal and external consultants and what have you. How do you, this isn't the question I expect you to answer, bridge that gap between complexity and questions around that and the numbered lists that we're all involved with in the day-to-day? It's saying we need to ask the right question, I think, is right, but that leaves a question of how do we have the conversations that arrives at the right questions?
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. So that was why I developed this thing called a warm data lab, which kind of gets to your question of how is this workable in OD too, which is a way of working with people. I don't know if we're going to have time to do it today, but I do them all over the world, and you can try to chime in sometime. And I'm training people how to do it too. But it's kind of like open space, except for that it uses contextual process, and so people move through different contextual conversations until they get a depth of understanding of the interdependency. Now, when you have a group of people who actually are settled in that space of interdependency, you're in another place to ask questions together. And the numbered list, I think, is, the numbered list is a response to a world that we have been trained to look at as a mechanistic process. Okay, so this is a holdover from engineering, design, and nothing wrong with it. It's just that it doesn't work very well with living systems. In life, the context and the nonverbal, the indirect, the irrational processes are in the living relational world. So those lists tend to be very linear, and even when one of the items on the list is nonlinear, it's still it's still there. So it's about that shift in focus from the items to the relationship between them. It's not impossible. I'm doing it all over the place. So anyway, if you want to learn more about warm data labs, let me know. Do we have one more? No? Okay. Then I have something that I want to read to you. Because I want you to know that I am deeply and truly inspired and hopeful about our quest and our possibilities. And this is a poem from my book, Small Arcs of Larger Circles. And it's called We Are Wine. Steeped in history, building a shadowy bouquet, unable to reassemble ourselves as grapes. We're wound into a richness we cannot undo. Beautiful still, and with a destiny that's vaguely related to vines, we still know water and wind. We know the stories of the keepers of the casks. We know the versions of civilizations that sing, there is goodness. A look to the future of solutions is a potion table of bubbling mysteries, soaked in folded learnings, lost threads, unseen outcomes. We are not, and yet we are grapes always.